In its earliest days, tabletop role-playing games were rigorous exercises in military logistics. Players huddled around maps calculating resource depletion, troop movements, and tactical advantages. This obsession with logic birthed a design philosophy known as Gygaxian naturalism. A dungeon was required to function as a pseudo-realistic ecosystem. If you had a goblin lair here, you needed a logical water source and a food chain to support them. Monsters needed practical reasons to coexist. This strict realism created a creative bottleneck. By forcing ecological sense, designers excluded the irrational. There was no room in a perfectly balanced spreadsheet for the surreal, the uncanny, or the genuinely terrifying. Enter Tom Moldvay. By 1981, Moldvay was an editor and designer at TSR who felt restricted by this simulationism. He wanted to inject the game with the weird, fatalistic pulp fiction he loved reading. His answer to the problem was a 1981 publication called Dungeon Module X2, Castle Amber. To make it work, Moldvay systematically dismantled the established rules of biological realism. For the medium to move into psychological territory, the hobby first had to outgrow its own rigid rules for how reality was supposed to function. Castle Amber doesn't ask for permission to start the adventure. Players resting during a mundane journey are swallowed by a deadly gray mist. If you try to walk back through it, you die. It immediately traps the characters within the grounds. When the fog clears, they aren't in a dark cave. They find themselves trapped on the sprawling grounds of a decadent estate, suspended completely outside of normal space and time. This blueprint illustrates dream logic, ignoring physics. You might step from an aristocratic dining room directly into an indoor forest. The cursed Amber family's madness warps the pocket dimension, letting dungeon masters place disconnected threats in adjacent rooms, like a dragon beside an amoeba. By removing naturalistic predictability, the castle architecture itself becomes a psychological antagonist. It is built to keep the players off balance, doubting every door they open. Moldvay actively subverted the mechanical expectations of combat. Deep in the castle, players stumble into a boxing match against magical constructs called Magen. Instead of fighting to the death, players navigate a 5-round point system governed by an aristocrat referee who casts high-level spells to strictly enforce the rules of the ring. Once players escape the mansion, they are dropped into a parallel dimension called Averoin. Here, the rules change again. Powerful wizards who are used to casually throwing fireballs are suddenly forced to use diplomacy or hide their abilities to avoid execution. This atmosphere of dread was achieved through explicit literary pastiche. Moldvay formally licensed the weird fiction of early 20th century author Clark Ashton Smith to build out the setting of Averoin. The module openly credits Smith, but it harbors a secret. In Room 25, players meet Charles Amber, a man suffering from sensory hypersensitivity who is losing his mind because he swears he can hear his sister Madeline crying out from the tomb where she was buried alive. It is a nearly verbatim lift of the sibling dynamic from the 1839 story, The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. By blending stolen Gothic literature with jarring, highly specific custom mechanics, Castle Amber ensures that players cannot rely on standard tactical strategies to survive. You might expect tactical wargamers of the 1980s to reject this tonal shift, but Castle Amber was a commercial and critical success during the hobby's greatest period of growth. This success suggested that players were willing to trade predictable logistics for a fever dream atmosphere. This shift away from simulationism redirected TSR's narrative priorities, proving that mood could be just as engaging as a strictly logical ecosystem. The module's defining narrative hook, swallowing players in a mysterious mist and trapping them in a cursed domain ruled by tragic nobility, became a blueprint for later designers. 2 years later, that identical concept was used by Tracy and Laura Hickman to create Ravenloft, establishing the most enduring horror franchise in tabletop history. Realism and logic remain the industry's standard tools for immersion, but as the enduring legacy of this module proves,